Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the Republicans released their tax plan, and unsurprisingly, it is a gift-wrapped tax cut to the rich. Christmas came early, Mr. Speaker. From huge corporate tax cuts to the elimination of the alternative minimum tax paid by the wealthiest Americans, this tax plan will hurt our economy and prioritize the top earners in our country. But there is one person, maybe a group of people, that are very, very thrilled about this tax plan, Mr. Speaker, and that person is Mr. Moneybags. Here he is. Mr. Moneybags is really going to benefit from this tax plan. And first of all, the President himself will greatly benefit from the tax plan. It's impossible to know exactly how much because we still don't have his tax returns. He has refused to release them. And we would really appreciate, and we demand, frankly, that the American people know exactly how much he's going to benefit from this tax plan. Mr. Speaker, as the Vice Chair of the House Budget Committee, I saw firsthand how Republicans rammed through a budget bill that paved the way for the massive Ryan McConnell tax giveaway to the wealthy. Frankly, as a new member, I find it an affront to the legislative process, an affront to families across the United States in red and blue states alike, that we did not have hearings on that budget, that we are not going to have hearings on this tax plan, a complete rewrite of the U.S. economy that is going to be pushed through apparently in weeks or less. We still have no score on this because we just saw the details of a tax plan today. And so the Republicans have made this habit of relying on fake logic and faulty assumptions, and they did it with health care and the budget, and it's safe to assume that that is what we're looking at here. These cuts do not pay for themselves. And despite the claims that this tax plan is really going to help middle-class Americans, the reality is that it's going to hurt millions of American families just to fast-track tax cuts for millionaires, billionaires, and large corporations. And if the Republicans are so opposed to so-called government handouts, as we're always told they're called, then why is it that they seem to be more willing to hand out everything we have to the wealthiest people in this nation? Now, we're still exploring all of the details of this tax plan that was just released today, but there's no question that this bill is going to make sure that the wealthiest individuals and the largest corporations in this country get a tax cut of millions of dollars. Million, if you happen to be in the top 10th of 1%, then bingo, Mr. Moneybags is going to get $1 million in a tax cut every year. And consider this, because if this tax bill lines up with the budget resolution, then 80% of the Republican tax cut goes to the top 1% by 2027. The average tax cut for the top 1% in 2027 would be $207,000. For millionaires, the cut would be $230,000. And as I said, for the top 1/10 of 1%, you get to have $1 million a year. The middle class, on the other hand, 42 million middle-class households would face a tax increase. And let's not be fooled by this idea that the standard deduction is going up, because let me tell you what that means. It means that along with the standard deduction going up, you are also getting your credits for individual children taken away, the itemization of that. So if you have a family with several children, as many Americans do, you will actually end up probably being able to deduct less. And let's also be clear that when you eliminate the deduction for state and for property taxes and state and local taxes, then and you cut all of the services that are going to be required to be cut if you're going to pay for this tax cut, then you will end up paying more in your states, both in terms of the SALT deduction, but also in terms of all of the increased taxes you're going to have to pay at the local level to fund things like infrastructure and education. So let's be clear that this plan gives a $4 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest 1% and largest corporations, taxes 42 million working families more, and borrows millions from the future to give those tax cuts. Now, last week in the Rules Committee, I offered an amendment to the Republican budget resolution that would have stopped some of the most egregious impacts of the billionaire's budget. my amendment would have said that none of the tax cuts proffered in this plan should apply to households in that top 1% of income earners. It would have plainly said that the United States is not in the business of giving massive tax cuts to those who are already incredibly wealthy. And Mr. Speaker, I talked about some of the millionaires in my district because I do have some. I'm fortunate to have a good economy in Seattle where we have a $15 minimum wage, where we have paid family leave for everybody, and yet business is still booming, the economy is doing well, we have people who have done well, and they would like to pay their fair share. For decades, Republicans have prioritized the interests of the corporations and the wealthiest ahead of working-class families. And what we are being proposed in this budget, in this tax plan, is exactly what Republicans in Kansas proposed in 2012. In 2012, a Republican governor and Republican legislature in Kansas passed through the same thing. They said, let's make sure that we have tax benefits for these pass-through corporations. By the way, Donald Trump owns 500 pass-through corporations. He will benefit greatly from this. Let's make sure that we reduce the tax rates on the wealthiest, and in doing so, we will make sure that we're investing in the economy. That meant, by the way, all those tax cuts had to be paid for, so a $700 million cut to the Kansas state budget, which resulted in schools not being able to operate full-time, resulted in roads being in disrepair, ultimately resulted in Kansas's bond ratings going down. And in the end, that GDP growth that we were promised, the economic growth that was guaranteed if you were to put the money into the top corporations and the top income earners that was supposed to somehow trickle down, that growth never came to be. So guess what happened, Mr. Speaker? The Republican legislature in Kansas rolled back those tax cuts. They said that trickle-down thing didn't work, the promises of economic growth didn't work, and ultimately they had to move it back, and finally Kansas is starting to come out of that by investing in working families. Because ultimately, I believe, and I think Democrats believe, that if you invest in regular folks, if you put the money into working families, you give them a tax cut and you make sure that they are actually paying less, not more, even if you say that you're giving them a deduction, in the end they're paying more in this tax plan. But if you invest the money there, instead of taking $270 billion that is proposed by repealing the estate tax, which only a tiny portion of people pay, by the way, that estate tax, that 5,400 families are going to get $270 billion in this Republican tax plan. I say, let's take that money and give it to working families instead of to those. Now, I think that we have a lot of different options. The Congressional Progressive Caucus has put forward our own budget, a people's budget with our own tax principles. And the bottom line is we believe in ordinary Americans. We believe that if you invest there and you give people the opportunity to work in good jobs, to earn good wages, and to really make sure that they have dignity, respect, and can save for the future, can send their kids to college, that ultimately that builds our economy. And so I'm really honored to be doing this, this special order hour with my good friends and colleagues, and we're going to do a little bit of a